This dude is so jacked he joined MMA just to fight people legally. He's the only person in history to earn 6 strongman titles. Whether it was pulling super heavy trucks, a train, or an entire airplane, nobody could beat him. Mariusz Pudzianowski was so massive that when he challenged a local mafia boss to fight, people accused him of assault and sent him to jail. He eventually got bored of showing off his physique, so he decided to join the MMA. But in the MMA world, his big muscles are useless. He simply wanted to fight people and had terrible fighting technique. But despite this, he was still a beast. At his first fight, he easily destroyed his opponent in 43 seconds. The referee had to keep him back just so he wouldn't kill his opponent. Mariusz has now won 17 matches and lost 9. 12 of his wins are by knockout, which just goes to show how strong he really is. This dude is so jacked he joined MMA just to fight people legally. He's the only person in history to earn 6 strongman titles. Whether it was pulling super heavy trucks, a train, or an
Which animal can help you survive the next food crisis? Did you get it right? You might be surprised to see how it's...
Welcome to the Raptor News channel. A major attack was launched on the area where Hamas's last fuel reserves are located. As a result of this attack, it is planned to temporarily halt the generators used by Hamas forces. The reason for targeting the fuel supply to the generators is Israel's desire to leave the tunnels known as the Gaza Metro in darkness. Before initiating a major operation in the Gaza Strip, the Netanyahu administration is attempting to eliminate the tunnels that pose the greatest threat. Therefore, the Israeli Navy launched a major attack on the area where the port warehouses are located, in the southwest of Gaza, bordering Egypt. Warships approaching the coast, Han Yunus and Rafah, carried out a powerful assault on the warehouses along the shoreline. During the attack, Hamas forces retaliated against the warships. However, the warships were positioned well beyond the range of Hamas forces, and as a result, they managed to destroy the warehouses in the area. Nevertheless, Hamas forces utilized kamikaze drones against the warships. This led to the activation of the air defense systems on the warships. The Israeli Air Force actually flew a Gulfstream G550 AWACS aircraft throughout the day, providing surveillance and reconnaissance intelligence over the sea in the northwest of Gaza. After gathering real-time intelligence from unmanned aerial vehicles in the region, this aircraft returned to its base following a lengthy 3-hour reconnaissance operation. As a result of these reconnaissance missions, the Israeli Air Force initially targeted the Navy and fuel depots from the air. Subsequently, a command center in the Rafah refugee camp area was also targeted. It was revealed that this targeted location served as a point of constant communication between Hamas forces and Egyptian units, as well as a conduit for transporting ammunition and equipment from the northeastern regions of Egypt. In other words, independently of Egypt, Hamas forces had stockpiled a significant amount of ammunition in the tunnels in the immediate west of Gaza. In response to this situation, the Israeli Air Force first destroyed the communications center and then conducted 2 bombings in the open areas north of the border crossing. The reason for the bombings in the open area was not to destroy the tunnels completely, and it remains uncertain whether the tunnels were entirely eliminated. However, aid trucks at the border crossing returned following the bombings. Consequently, the aid sent by the Egyptian government to the region was completely cut off. Following these attacks, the Israeli Air Force called for the evacuation of the area after determining the presence of ammunition and equipment on cargo ships in the port area of Gaza. Once the port area was completely evacuated, Israeli fighter jets targeted the cargo ships identified in the area. It is reported that cargo ships were used by the Iran-backed Hezbollah terrorist organization to supply Hamas forces with missiles and necessary equipment. While this cannot be fully confirmed, the Israeli military began directly targeting the warehouses where the cargo ships believed to be a threat were unloading their cargo. As a result of the explosions in the warehouses, the region experienced significant blasts. The exact cause of these explosions is not known. However, Israeli intelligence had made a significant discovery. A person known as the spokesperson for Hamas forces lost his life in an airstrike conducted in the northern part of Gaza. This attack indicates that Israeli intelligence initiated a comprehensive cleansing operation against Hamas forces. On the Lebanese border, tensions have escalated significantly. The Iran-backed Hezbollah terrorist organization carried out an attack on a military outpost located in the northwest of the Arab al-Aramshi town. The attack, using a guided anti-tank missile, inflicted substantial damage on the outpost's exterior armor. Subsequently, a militia group targeted an Israeli armored vehicle with 2 anti-tank missiles. In response, Israeli soldiers stationed at the outpost opened fire in the direction of the attack. A Hermes 900 spy drone near the area directly arrived at the location of the outpost to identify the point where the attacks were carried out. Subsequently, the unmanned aerial vehicle successfully struck the areas where Hezbollah had positioned itself. During the attack, the UAV identified the outpost used by the Hezbollah organization and conducted attacks on the outpost. After the complete destruction of the outpost, military bases in the Arab al-Aramshi town were shelled with artillery fire by the organizations on the Lebanese side. Following the bombardment, the Israeli army began to retaliate. As a result, both sides began to continually exchange artillery fire. North of the outpost, Hezbollah groups opened intense fire with machine guns. After Israeli fighter jets dropped bombs, the conflicts in the area subsided somewhat. However, after the attacks, Hezbollah admitted to hitting the Israeli outpost with guided missiles. Following these statements, the Netanyahu administration ordered more than 200 armored vehicles to move toward the northern border. The Israeli army also began establishing a military zone in the Lebanese region. Meanwhile, the evacuation of residents in northern Israel has begun. To the east of the attacked outpost, the exact location of Hezbollah's reconnaissance base was identified. Israeli unmanned aerial vehicles began conducting deep flights in southern Lebanon. In fact, a UAV flying west of the city of Bint Jubel, the largest city in the region, managed to pinpoint the exact location of Hezbollah groups in the area. Consequently, the UAV conducted a significant reconnaissance in the southeast of the city, uncovering an important Hezbollah base. In response, the Israeli Air Force initiated a cross-border operation to target Hezbollah's assembly areas in the region. After the complete destruction of the reconnaissance base, Israeli fighter jets left Lebanese airspace. Following these attacks, it was confirmed that Hezbollah groups in Lebanon were moving southward, indicating preparations for a major attack on northern Israel. Meanwhile, Hamas groups continue to carry out infiltration operations from 2 points. Extensive defenses have been developed against groups attempting to infiltrate from the north and northeast of Gaza. The Israeli army has established a military zone up to 30 kilometers into the Gaza Strip. Consequently, unmanned aerial vehicles continuously monitor movements in the area. In case of any suspicious activity, Israeli artillery directly strikes the region. Due to continuous monitoring of the area, Israeli forces have destroyed 9 potential infiltration points. However, Hamas forces continue to use 2 of the destroyed locations. Currently, the Israeli army has started deploying a significant number of troops to the Zikim region. Furthermore, the 51st Battalion of the Golani Brigade is positioned to the east of the Kisufim town. It has been confirmed that this unit is moving southward due to its continuous mobilization. In the southern border areas, there is a constant state of activity, and Israeli forces are also attempting to establish a large gathering area in the southern part of the country. This is because intelligence sources believe that there is a significant presence of Hamas forces in the border region of Egypt. We'll see what happens in the coming days. We have come to the end of another video. You can like the video to support us by subscribing. You can easily follow new videos. I wish you all happy days. See you. Happy days.
The following is a conversation with Jared Kushner, former senior advisor to the president during the Donald Trump administration, and author of Breaking History, a White House memoir. He's one of the most influential and effective presidential advisors in modern history, helping conduct negotiations with some of the most powerful leaders in the world and deliver results on trade, criminal justice reform, and historic progress towards peace in the Middle East. On Thursday, October 5th, we recorded conversation on topics of war and peace, history and power in the Middle East and beyond. This was about a day and a half before the Hamas attack on Israel. And then we felt we must sit down again on Monday, October 9th, and add a discussion on the current situation. We opened the podcast with the second newly recorded part. My heart goes out to everyone who has and is suffering in this war. I pray for your strength and for the long-term peace and flourishing of the Israeli and Palestinian people. I love you all. This is the Lex Friedman Podcast. And now, dear friends, here's Jared Kushner. We did a lot of this conversation before the Hamas attack on Israel, and we decided to sit down again and finish the discussion to address the current situation, which is still developing. If I may, allow me to summarize the situation as it stands today. It's morning, Monday, October 9th. On Saturday, October 7th at 6:30 a.m. Israel time, Hamas fired thousands of rockets into southern Israel. The rocket attack served as cover for a multi-pronged infiltration of Israel territory by over 1,000 Hamas militants. This is shortly after, at 7:40 a.m. The Hamas militants went door to door in border towns, killing civilians and taking captives, including women and children. In response to this, Israeli Air Force began carrying out strikes in Gaza, also fighting on the ground in Israel to clear out Hamas militants from Israel territory and preparing to mobilize Israeli troops for a potential ground attack on Hamas in Gaza. Now, of course, this is what it appears to be right now, and this, along with other things, might change because the situation is still developing. The IDF is ordering civilian residents of Gaza to evacuate their homes for their safety. Benjamin Netanyahu declared war in several statements and warned Israelis to brace themselves for a long and difficult war. Just today, Israeli ministers ordered a, quote, complete siege of Gaza, interrupting supplies of electricity, food, water, and fuel from Israel to Gaza. As of now, October 9th, the death toll is over 1,200 people, and over 130 hostages taken to Gaza by Hamas. So, as I said, the events are rapidly unfolding, so these numbers will sadly increase. But hopefully our words here can at least in part speak to the timeless underlying currents of the history and, as you write about, the power dynamics of the region. So for people who don't know, Gaza is a 25 miles long, 6 miles wide strip of territory along the Mediterranean Sea. It borders Israel on the east and north and Egypt on the southwest. It's densely populated, about 2.3 million people. And there's been a blockade of Gaza by Israel and Egypt since 2007 when Hamas took power. I could just summarize that Hamas is a Palestinian militant group which rules the Gaza Strip. It originated in 1988 and it came to power in Gaza in 2006. As part of its charter, it's sworn to the destruction of Israel, and it is designated by the United States, European Union, UK, and of course Israel as a terrorist group. So given that context, what are your feelings as a human being, and what is your analysis as the former senior advisor to the president under the Trump administration of the current situation in Israel and Gaza?
So I think you did an excellent job of summarizing a lot of the context, but watching what's unfolded over the last 48 hours has been truly heartbreaking to see. We're still in the early stages of what's developing, but seeing the images on X of militants, terrorists going door to door with machine guns, gunning down innocent civilians, seeing beheaded Israeli soldiers, seeing young 20-year-olds at a rave, a dance party to celebrate peace, with militants flying in and then shooting machine guns to kill people indiscriminately, seeing young children captive and held prisoner, seeing 80-year-old grandmothers, a Holocaust survivor, also being taken captive. These are just images and actions that we have not seen in this world since 9/11. This is a terror attack on the scale of which we have not seen, and it's been incredibly hard for a lot of people to comprehend. My heart goes out, obviously, to all of the families of the victims, to the families of those who are held in captive now, and to all of Israel, because one of the beautiful things about the state of Israel is that when one Israeli is hurting, the entire nation comes together. It's a shame that it's taking an action like this to unify the nation, but I have seen incredibly beautiful signs over the last 48 hours of a country coming together. The Jewish people have been under oppression before. The Jewish people know what it's like. And seeing people rally together to fight for their homeland, to try to reestablish safety, is a very beautiful thing to watch. I wish it wasn't something we had to watch, but it is. With that being said, though, the backdrop, I've been speaking to friends over the last couple of days. One friend I spoke with last night who was saying that a good friend messaged him saying, "I'm going in, we're going to do some operations to try to free some of the hostages held in one of the kibbutzes." Messaged him the next morning. He was one of the first through the door to try to free these hostages, and he was killed by a Hamas militant. And sadly, we're going to be hearing many, many more stories of brave Israeli soldiers trying to get these terrorists out of Israel, trying to free innocent civilians who unfortunately are risking their lives to do it. And, they're all heroes, but some will have a less good fate than others, sadly. So it's a very, very heartbreaking moment. And I do think that it's very important at this moment in time for the entire world to stand behind Israel. I think that Hamas has shown the entire world who they really are. I think what their aim is, what they're willing to do, and all of the strong security that Israel's put in place over the last years, which in some instances was criticized, I think is now being validated that there was a real threat that they were looking to deter. So short answer is my heart is broken, praying for peace, praying for strength, praying for praying for Israel to do what it needs to do to avoid being in this situation again, which is either eliminating or severely degrading Hamas's capabilities. There cannot be peace in Israel and in the Middle East while there is a terror group that is being funded by Iran that is allowed to flourish and is allowed to plan operations that are going to aim to kill innocent civilians. And so, as somebody who was formerly in this position, who was intimately involved with Israel, with the strategies to minimize attacks from Hamas and to try to turn the region around, and I think we did do a very substantial job under President Trump. The Middle East went from one of the most chaotic regions in the world. You had ISIS in 2016. ISIS had a caliphate the size of Ohio. They were beheading journalists. They were killing Christians. They controlled 8 million people. They were planning attacks all over the world from their caliphate. They were using the internet to radicalize people. We had the San Bernardino shooting in America. We had the Pulse nightclub shooting in Orlando. And there was real threat. And then you had Iran, which was given $150 billion in a glide path to a nuclear weapon. And they were using their newfound riches to fund Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, different rebels all over the region that were looking to destabilize further. Syria was in a civil war where 500,000 people were killed. Yemen was destabilized. Libya was destabilized. And it was just a mess. And all of America's allies had felt betrayed. President Trump came into power. We rebuilt the trust and the relationships with all of our traditional allies. We were able to eliminate ISIS, the territorial caliphate. And then we were able to project strength in the region, really go after Iran's wallet. We were able to stop through crushing sanctions a lot of their financial resources, which they were using to fund all these terror groups. And so we left the Middle East with 6 peace deals and a fairly peaceful world. So seeing what's happening, I think it was completely avoidable. I think it's horrible to see that it's occurring. And I pray that those in power will make the right decisions to restore safety, but also to potentially create a better paradigm for peace in the future.
So I have a lot of questions to ask you about the journey towards this historic progress towards peace with the Abraham Accords. But first, on this situation, to step back and some of the history, is there things about the history of Hamas and Gaza that's important to understand what is happening now? Just your comments, your thoughts, your understanding of Hamas.
I think you did an excellent job, Lex, of really giving the summary. Just a couple things maybe I'll add to it is that Hamas was originally founded from the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, which is a group that's caused a lot of issues in the region. They've attacked Israel many times in the past. There's a lot of discussion about how Israel is an occupying power. Well, in Gaza in 2005, they withdrew from all the land, and then they say Israel's an apartheid state. Well, Israel then gave governance of the region to the Palestinians. And then what's happened is the Palestinian people's lives have now gone down, not up since then. I will say that under Hamas's leadership in Gaza, the people who have suffered the most are the Palestinian people. And I've watched cries throughout my time in government from people saying we want to see the Palestinian people live a better life. I agree with those people. I think that the Palestinian people in Gaza are essentially hostages. In Gaza, you have basically 2 million people that are being held hostage by 30,000 Hamas terrorists, and that's really the problem. And I would just encourage people to push their attention and energy in this moment and their anger towards Hamas. Those are the people who are killing innocent civilians, who are murdering indiscriminately, and those are the people who have held back the Palestinians from having a better life. And just finally, what I would say is, what we saw with Hamas was that if you go back to 2007, they basically had just one plan that they did over and over. And we were very careful to try to monitor very closely and stop the Iranian money and the resources from coming in. And again, we took a little bit of criticism from the international community from keeping the border tight. But unfortunately, every time you'd allow construction materials to go into Gaza, they'd use them to build tunnels, not homes. You would have equipment that would come in to build pipes, they turn it into bombs. So it was very, very hard to figure out how do you get the resources into Gaza to help people live a better life, while at the same time the leadership in Gaza was taking all of those resources and turning it into military equipment to attack Israel.
What role does Iran play in this war and this connection to Hamas? Can you speak to the connection between Hamas and Iran that's important to understand, especially as this most recent attack unfolds?
Sure. So the correlation, I mean, there's reports that Iran is behind the attack. Hamas has thanked Iran for their support. And it's been very well known that Iran supports the destruction of the state of Israel. And I won't say Iran as a country. I'll talk about Iran in the leadership. There's actually a beautiful thing I saw on the internet where at one of the soccer games in Iran, they were trying to, rally support for the Hamas terror attacks. And a lot of people in the crowds were chanting, F you to the regime, because I think the Iranian people, the Persian people generally are peace-loving people who don't want to see this focus on destruction and annihilation. But you saw this in 2015, 2016, when the Iranian government had resources, the region was less safe. And since, now there's been more resources allowed to go to the Iranian regime by lack of enforcement of sanctions. And as a result, Iran is funding Hezbollah, Hamas. They were funding the Houthis. Now there's a little bit of a detente between Saudi and Iran, which has led to that going down, which only further proves that Iran was behind the Houthis, which is what the Saudis had been saying for years and Iran was denying. So there's a very strong relationship between the two. And we always knew that the way that Iran fights wars or fights conflicts is never directly. It's usually through its proxies. And in this case, Hamas has been a proxy for Iran, who wanted to obviously see the destruction of Israel, but also does not want to see the Israelis and the Saudis come together for a peace agreement.
The name of this operation, of the Hamas operation, is Al-Aqsa Flood, referring to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. How much of this attack is about the Al-Aqsa Mosque?
In actuality, I don't think any of it is, but the Al-Aqsa Mosque is something that all of the Shia jihadists have used for years in order to justify their actions that are aggressive towards Israel. So this is something I'll maybe even take a step back and go through. When I was working initially in my first year on the peace plan, I was doing a lot of listening. And quite frankly, a lot of what people were saying to me didn't make sense. And the reason why I was trying to figure out, they were talking about sovereignty over Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Al-Aqsa Mosque is a mosque that's built in the Holy of Holies, the Haram al-Sharif in Israel, where the Jewish Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, was built in a very religious place. About after the temple was destroyed, then there was a big mosque built there, and it's one of the more holy places in Islam now. So the big thing everyone was saying is, what do you do with this land where you have a mosque built over a very big Jewish site? And I was hearing all of the experts, and I always say experts with quotes, because only in Washington can you work on something for a decade and continue to fail, and then you basically leave and are considered an expert. But that's one of the problems with Washington, which maybe we could talk about later. But the notion here was, I went and I said, let me try to understand what the issue is with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with the people, right? I always felt the politicians were a little disconnected, so I commissioned several focus groups, one in Amman, one in Cairo, one in Dubai, and one in Ramallah. And I asked, people, Muslims, what is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict about? Mm-hmm. And time again, the most popular thing that they said was that Israel was not allowing access to the mosque for Muslims to pray. And what was interesting is that Israel's policy is to allow anyone who wants to come and pray peacefully at the sites to come and pray. Sometimes they have security issues when there's provocations. But by and large, since 1967, when Israel was able to take back Jerusalem in a defensive war, just to be very clear, they were attacked in the south and they were attacked from the east. And they basically were able to beat back the Jordanians and the Egyptians and then reconquer the old city of Jerusalem. And during that time, immediately after, Israel then passed the Protection of Holy Places law, which was, they basically took resources they didn't have and they said, we're going to restore the Christian sites, the Muslim sites, the Jewish sites. And they've worked to allow everyone access to the mosque. So today, any Muslim who wants to come can come and pray at the mosque. The mosque is Israel's acknowledged that King Abdullah, the king of Jordan, is the custodian of the mosque. And as long as people want to come to the country and pray peacefully, they're able to do that. But if you look at a lot of the propaganda that's been used by ISIS or Iran to recruit terrorists or to justify their incursions, they often say they're doing it in the name of liberating the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But from an operational and pragmatic perspective today, any Muslim who wants to go to the mosque, you can book a flight to Israel now through Dubai, because there's flights between Israel and Dubai. And as long as your country has relations with Israel and they'll accept your passport in there, you can come and pray. And that's what Israel wants. Israel wants Jerusalem to be a place where all religions can come and celebrate together. But you have a lot of actors that look to find ways to use these religious tensions in order to sow division and justify violent behavior.
I wonder how it's possible to lessen the effectiveness of that propaganda message, that a lot of the war, a lot of the attacks are about access to the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Is there something you can speak to why that message hasn't disseminated across the Arab world?
So Israel's good at a lot of things. They're not very good traditionally with public relations. After the Abraham Accords, we made the first Abraham Accords deal in August 2020, and then we made 5 other deals. We first did United Arab Emirates, then we did a deal with Bahrain, then we did a deal with Kosovo, then we did a deal with Sudan, then we did a deal with Morocco, and then we got the GCC deal done as well. The tension between Qatar, Saudi, UAE, Egypt, and Bahrain, and that was allowing us to create a pathway to then pursue the Israeli-Saudi normalization. So we had so much momentum then that the goal was just keep getting more countries to normalize relations with Israel. Once you create the connection between people and create the ability for people to do business together, the ability for flights to fly between, then you would just start naturally having people coming, and everyone has a smartphone today, so they can then post and combat the misinformation that's been out there. By the way, this misinformation is not something that's new. One of the characters who played a very big role in spreading the anti-Semitism and the violence in Israel in the 1920s was a guy named Hajj Amin al-Husseini, who was known as the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He was very close with Hitler and Mussolini, and he was working with them to try to get some claims to the Middle East once the Jewish people were annihilated. And what he did for a very long time was he did the same shtick, only it was before you had smartphones and YouTube, where he would say the mosque is under attack, these imperialist Zionists are coming in to try to destroy the mosque. And he would use that to raise money from Indonesia, from Pakistan, from all over the world, and then use that threat to justify recruiting groups of young, vulnerable Muslim men, and then getting them in the name of religious rights to go and kill people, which really is more of a perversion of the religion than I think the true essence of what Islam is. I think Islam at its core is a peaceful religion, and I think that's where a lot of the great leaders in Islam want to take it. But the people who use Islam or the mosque or as a justification for violence, those are people who I think are really they are disrespecting the Islam religion.
As you said, you helped make major strides towards peace in the Middle East with the Abraham Accords. Can you describe what it took to accomplish this? And maybe this will help us understand what broke down and led to the tragedy this week.
Yeah. So, I always believed in foreign policy. I learned very quickly that the difference between a political deal and a business deal is that in a business deal, you have a problem set, you come to a conclusion, and then if you buy or sell something, you either have, more cash or you have a company. So more to do, less to do.
Led to the tragedy.
Political problem set is very different, where the conclusion of a problem set is essentially the beginning of a new paradigm. So when I would think about how do you move pieces around the board, you couldn't say, let me just solve the problem. You have to think about what happens the day after the signing and how do you create a paradigm that has positivity to it. So the biggest piece of what President Trump did during his 4 years in office was he really strengthened the relationship with Israel, number one. And he did things like recognizing Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. He moved the embassy to Jerusalem. He recognized the Golan Heights. He got out of the Iran deal. We did an economic conference in Bahrain where we brought Israelis to meet with Saudi and Emirati and Qatari businessmen, and everyone came together, and each one of these instances were unthinkable previously. And everyone said that if you did it, the world was going to end. And every time President Trump did one, the next morning the sun rose, the next evening the sun set, and things moved on. And so by doing that, what President Trump did was he slaughtered a lot of the sacred cows of these false barriers that people had erected, and showed people that the vast majority of the people in the Middle East, whether they're Jewish, Muslim, Christian, whatever religion they are, they just want to live better lives. And so what we basically did was create a paradigm where the voices for peace, the voices for together, now finally had a forum where they were able to do it. And we did that in the backdrop. The way we were able to be successful was we severely limited the resources of Iran, and they were focused more internally, and they couldn't cause the trouble that they were causing everywhere else. Since we've left, obviously the dynamics have changed, but the way you get to peace is obviously, number one, through strength, and number two, by finding a way for people to be better off tomorrow than they are today. And what I found was that most of the voices looking for violence or trouble were people who were just focused on what happened 2 years ago, 20 years ago, 70 years ago, 1,000 years ago. People who are trying to solve those problems in that context often were looking more to use those past grievances as a justification for their power and for the bad behavior that they were looking to perpetuate.
So managing, as we have talked about extensively, managing the power dynamics of the region and providing a plan. And this is something you did with the economic plan titled Peace to Prosperity, a Vision to Improve the Lives of the Palestinian and Israeli People. Can you first of all describe what's in the plan?
Sure. So this was something I took on. I was working on the political framework between the Israelis and the Palestinians and trying to understand what were the issues. And the issues were not very many. It basically was you had a land dispute, so you had to figure out where do you put borders ultimately. You had a security a paradigm, which I was much more favorable to Israel's perspective on. And obviously the events of the past 48 hours have fully justified that bias. And then in addition to that, you had to deal with the religious sites. But I felt operationally that wasn't actually as complicated as people made it, because you wanted to just leave it open for everybody. Then I went through and I felt that the Palestinian leadership was fairly disincentivized to make a deal, because there was just this paradigm where they had billions of dollars coming in from the international community. And I think that they feared that if they made a deal, they would lose their relevancy internationally and the money would stop flowing into the country. So what I tried to do is to say, my approach when I would get into a hard problem, say, how do I understand all the different escape hatches? How do I try to eliminate them and then build a golden bridge that becomes really the only, but also the most desirable pathway for the decision makers to walk through? And it wasn't always hard, and sometimes you have to go and hold their hand, or you try to pick them up and walk them across. But a lot of these leaders are very reluctant to change, and the dynamics of the Palestinians also were such that I think they were fairly stuck where they were. So we developed a business plan for Gaza, the West Bank. We threw in some improvements for Jordan and Egypt as well. I based it off of the Vision 2030 that they did in Saudi Arabia, which I thought was a visionary document. I went back through this process and I studied basically every economic project in the post-World War II period. So we looked at what they did in South Korea, why it was successful with some strong industrial planning. We looked at Japan. We looked at Singapore. We looked at Poland, why it was successful. We spent a lot of time on the Ukraine plan for the country and why it wasn't successful. And that was mostly because of governance and corruption, which actually resembles a lot of what's gone wrong with the Palestinians, where there's no property rights, there's no rule of law. And what we did is we built a plan to show, it's not that hard, right? In the sense that between the West Bank and Gaza, you had 5 million people. And we put together a plan. I think it was about $27 billion. We got together a conference. I had the head of AT&T. We had Steve Schwartzman from Blackstone came, which was very gracious of them. We had all the leading Arabic businessmen, the leading builders, leading developers, and the general consensus of that conference was that this is very doable. We think that for Gaza in particular, it would cost maybe $7 to $8 billion to rebuild the entire place. We felt we could reduce the poverty rate in half. We can create over 1 million jobs there. The only thing that people said was holding it back wasn't Israel. what was holding him back was governance, and people wouldn't have confidence investing there with the rule that Hamas was perpetuating. So I encourage people actually to look at the plan. It was very thoughtful. It was 181 pages. We went project by project. Each project is costed out. It's a real plan that could be implemented, but you need the right governance. And all of the different Arabic countries are willing to fund it. The international community is willing to fund it because they've just been throwing so much money at the Palestinians for years. That's never been outcomes-based or conditions-based. It's just been, entitlement money. And unfortunately, it hasn't really achieved any outcomes that have been successful. So it's a great business plan. It just shows too, rebuilding Gaza, could be easy. But like I said, the problem that's held the Palestinian people back and that's made their lives terrible in Gaza has not been Israel. It's really been Hamas's leadership or lack of leadership and their desire to focus on trying to kill Israelis and start war with Israel over improving the lives of the Palestinian people.
And the current approach of Hamas, the more violence they perpetrate, the more they can hold on to power versus improving the lives of people. So they, as you said, maybe you can comment on, they do not propose an economics plan.
I mean, Hamas has been running it now for 16 years, and they don't have a lot to show for it. And, our posture with them was basically a very simple deal. If you think about what's the end state in Gaza, it's actually not that complicated. It's, there's no territorial disputes, right? The border's the border. There's no religious issues there as well. You're not dealing with Jerusalem. You're basically just dealing with the fact that, Israel wants to make sure that there's no threat from Gaza. So it's a demilitarization or some kind of security guarantee from a credible source where Israel doesn't feel like Gaza can be used to stage attacks into Israel or to fire rockets into Israel. And by the way, these are things I was saying, 3-4 years ago, that was the objective. And that was really the fear. Now that's been proven, unfortunately, the fear has manifested. And in exchange, you can rebuild the place and you can give the people a much better life. But Hamas has not shown a desire for that or a capability for that. And I don't think there's enough trust to allow them to do that, which is why, under the current circumstances, if you do want to have peace there, Hamas has to be either eliminated or severely degraded in terms of their military capabilities.
I would love to ask you about leadership, especially on the side of the United States. What has the current administration, the Biden administration, done different than the Trump administration, as you understand, that may have contributed to the events we saw this week?
So all I can talk about are where we left them, right? We left them a place where they had tremendous momentum in the Middle East. I met with them during the transition and said, look, we even got the Qatar, Saudi conflict done, which was a big, no peace between Israel and Saudi would have been possible without that. So we even got that done in our lame duck period. And they came in and they said, look, we want to focus on the 3 C's, which is COVID, climate change, and China. And I said, well, that's great. But, the Middle East, we have an amazing place right now. It's stable. There's momentum. Iran is basically broke. We put such crippling sanctions on Iran that they went from about, I think it was 2.6 million barrels a day of oil they were selling to about 100,000 under Trump. So their foreign currency reserves were basically depleted and they were broke. Same with the Palestinians. We stopped the funding to UNRWA, the UN agency, which is totally corrupt. It's we've put $10 billion in there over time. I did a poll in the Middle East, in Gaza, to say, okay, we've invested $10 billion here as a country. Are we popular? Mm-hmm. Right? The U.S. had a 7% approval rating. USAID had a 70% approval rating, but it just felt like a waste of our taxpayer dollars. And again, we wanted to make it conditions-based. The Biden administration came in. Number one, they started insulting, Saudi and Russia. Oil prices went up. At the same time, what they did was they stopped domestic production of oil. They disincentivized a lot of oil and shale production with regulations. They stopped pipelines. Oil prices went up. They stopped enforcing the sanctions against Iran, probably to get the oil prices lower to make up for what they were doing. They ran to Iran to try to make a deal. They started funding the Palestinians again right away. And I even said, if you're going to fund them, if that's your policy, I respect that. Again, elections have consequences, and you can take a different policy. But what I would recommend is get some conditions, make them do some reforms, make them give property rights to people, make them, do real economic investments for people. But they just went right away. So they were funding the Palestinians, not enforcing the sanctions, and then overall just projecting a lot of weakness in the region. So one of the most embarrassing examples is what happened in the United Arab Emirates. Again, an amazing, probably one of America's best allies over the last 20, 30 years. They fought with us in Afghanistan. They were the first Muslim country to stand up and do that after 9/11 because they didn't want it to be a war of the West against the Muslim religion. So they joined the fight because they saw it as a fight between right and wrong. They have rockets shot into their country from the Houthis, and they basically don't get a call from the U.S. for 17 days. They need their equipment that they buy from the U.S., which creates jobs in the U.S. They need it restocked. We don't call. So they've severely degraded the trust that we had to rebuild with our allies. I think they've been working now to get it back. They, after 2 years, started working with Saudi and Israel, which I think was good. I think that they realized after a stint that maybe the process that President Trump had created in the region was the right policy. And keep in mind, President Trump's policy was that I was working on was very strongly criticized during the first 3 years before we were able to achieve the results because it was departure from the failed policies of the past. And so first there was a return to those policies, appease Iran, let's criticize Saudi Arabia. Then they started embracing and working on the Israel-Saudi deal, which was really exciting. I think we were all very excited about it. But they did it in public. And I think that also was something, again, I didn't have access to their intelligence, so I assumed that by doing it so publicly, they thought that they'd either had a deal with Iran because they were letting them get all this revenue where Iran wouldn't be a problem. But one of the reasons with the Abraham Accords, we kept it so quiet during the whole time was because we always felt like the troublemakers in the region, particularly Iran, who we thought would be disadvantaged by having UAE, Saudi, Israel all together. Israel's a nuclear power. You have other strong economies. Iran seeks instability. They seek looking to create division in the region. And if you can create that economic sphere where you have security from Haifa to Muscat, from Israel to Oman, all the way through with Saudi, Jordan, UAE, Qatar, Egypt, that's an incredibly powerful bloc. If you can make it secure and then get economic integration, that really could be a Middle East that thrives. So Iran obviously wanted nothing to do with that, and that's why they've been working to disrupt. So I think the administration they took an incredibly stable situation with momentum. I think they underestimated the way that Iran would approach the region to undermine. I think they gave way too much rope to Iran, and I think that they didn't seize when they had an opportunity of strength with the Palestinians to try to drive to a conclusion that I believe could have prevented us being where we are today. Not to mention that, even just 3 weeks ago, it's a bad look that they just, basically gave $6 billion to Iran in exchange for hostages. And then Iran's basically funding these terror attacks that are killing American citizens. You have in Israel. And it's a heartbreaking situation. Again, totally avoidable, and one that I think has been very badly mismanaged to date.
If Trump was currently president, you were still working with him on this part of the world, what actions would you take? What conversations would you have? What ideas would you be working with in order to unite the various allies that you mentioned in the Middle East over this tragedy, and not let it be a thing that divides the Middle East, but make it a thing that catalyzes progress towards peace, further progress towards peace?
So I want to say one thing, Lex. I have a lot of friends who are fans of Trump, who are not fans of Trump. But one thing I want to say with absolute certainty is that if President Trump was in office, this never would have happened. And when President Trump was in office, anyone who supports Israel or who wants to see, Jewish people not be innocently slaughtered, he would never have allowed that to happen. It did not happen when he was in power. And I hope people recognize that as something that's very, very true. How I would play the ball where it lies right now. Keep in mind, we transferred the ball. It was on the green. Now it's almost like it's gone back, 150 yards and it's in a sand trap. I think the way that I would play the ball right now is, number one is you have to show strength. I actually think President Biden's words were the right words. I see that they're moving aircraft carriers to the region. Again, the purpose of having a strong military, I believe, obviously, if you get into a war, you want to win the war, but the purpose of a very strong military primarily is to avoid a war. I don't know what kind of credibility the Biden administration has to show the strength, but right now you have to support Israel completely. You have to really let people in the region know that there'll be consequences if they try to escalate. Again, we saw a little bit of rocket skirmish from Lebanon, from Hezbollah. But again, this is the type of thing that they have to know there'll be severe consequences if they make this a multi-party fight. And I think sending a strong message to Iran, I think that they have to see some consequences from this and know that they're not going to be allowed to have a free reign to cause instability, and that, Iran doesn't usually fight face to face. They usually do it through proxies. But let's just all be honest about where this is coming from and let them know that there will be a consequence if they instigate these actions. And again, at least with the Biden administration, they've had contact with Iran. They've been talking with Iran, but they've allowed Iran. I mean, again, the number I saw last year, I think under Trump, the number was maybe like $4 or $5 billion of oil revenue. And in total, I think last year it was something like $45 billion in revenue. This year, I think it'll be even more. That's a combination of them driving up oil prices, but also allowing much more sales. You would think that they would find a way to get them to behave and allow them to have this happen. Or if that's not the case, then be tough. Go back to being tough. That's what you have to do.
Building off of Abraham Accords, as you mentioned, Israel-Saudi normalization, there's been a lot of promising progress towards this. What does it take to not allow this tragedy damage the progress towards Israel-Saudi normalization?
I think right now it's probably not the best to think about that. I think that we want to think about that after whatever is going to happen now. I think right now the number one priority for Israel has to be to fully regain security in the country. And then number two is to figure out how you can, like I said, eliminate or degrade the Hamas capability or other Iranian threats to make sure that you have your security apparatus. I think that the Israeli leadership right now should proceed with that, and I don't think that they should be thinking about normalization with Saudi at this moment. My instinct, and I've been watching this Israeli-Saudi normalization play out, obviously just speaking with people and seeing what I've been reading, and watching with great excitement. I think it would be a game changer for the region. I think it's one of Iran's worst nightmares to have Israel and Saudi interlinked together. I think it'd be great for the Saudi people from a security perspective. What they're discussing with America would be very strong. The ability to get different elements across would be incredible. So what I would say with it is that the industrial logic held yesterday, and I think it will hold again tomorrow. So I always expect countries to act in their interests. I think that the deal that's on the table right now between Saudi, Israel, and America is in Saudi's interests, it's in America's interests, and it's in Israel's interests. What's going to happen now, though, is the political dynamics are going to shift. And I think that, as we've seen with political dynamics, they come and go. I think let's get through this moment. And then I hope at the right time that those talks will be able to resume and conclude in an appropriate way. And, it's funny, Lex, when I was working on the U.S.-Mexico agreement for the trade, we would have every day there'd be a tweet that would go out, or there would be an issue. I mean, people forget how intense it was between America and Mexico. And I would speak to my counterpart in Mexico after a rough day, and we were working on something, we were making progress, it'd get blown up. And I'd speak to him and say, you know what, look, they're not moving America, they're not moving Mexico. Let's just, let's stop for today, let's pick up tomorrow, and let's find a new way to bring this forward. So I would just encourage everyone working on that not to give up, to keep working hard at it, and to find a way. But like I said, I would take a little bit of a pause for the time being. Let's let the current situation play out, and then hopefully there'll be a way for it to move forward.
I just hope there's still people on the U.S. side picking up the phone and calling UAE, Saudi Arabia, just as human beings, as friends, as allies, and just keeping that channel of communication going. Because maybe you can correct me, but I just feel like there's just simple human dynamics that play out here, that divisions can form and just run away from you over simple misunderstandings, over just the inability to see a tragedy from the same perspective because of conversations that could have happened but didn't happen.
I think there'll definitely be communication, but words on phone calls is only worth so much. It's really trust between people and power, and obviously when you're in a position of power, you represent your country and your country's interests. But the ability to have trusting relationships where people feel like they're okay taking more risks to help each other, that's actually what's most important. So communication, I hope for, but deepening and trusting relationships. That's what I believe makes progress and keeps people safe.
And we talk quite extensively about the value of trust and negotiation and just working with leaders, which I think is a fascinating conversation. And you've taught me a lot about that. Let me ask you about the end here. What are the various trajectories this war can take, in your view? What are some of the end states, as you've said, which are desirable and are achievable?
I mentioned this earlier, but whenever I would get a problem set in government, I'd always think through, from a first principles perspective, what's the logical outcome, right? And forget about all the reasons why it can't happen. That's what everyone in governments always rush to talk about. But I do think here, number one, Israel has to have a secure environment where they don't feel threatened from Gaza. And number two is the people in Gaza need to have an environment where they feel like they can live a better life and have opportunities. So that's the end state. And so I think that the international community should come together. I do think that the people who are usually putting blame on Israel should now realize that maybe they've been a little bit harsh here, and that Hamas has been as big a threat, if not an even bigger threat, than Israel has been saying. And I do think that if the international community comes together and unites behind Israel and really forces Hamas and their Iranian backers to stop hostilities, to stop saber rattling, to stop misrepresenting the history in order to justify their violent behavior. And if they say instead, we want to hold you accountable, no more money, and they all say that they're going to stand behind Israel's efforts to eliminate their national security threats, and then we will all come together and only fund again into a framework that we believe can be a long-term solution where the Palestinian people really have a chance to live a better life. That's really the best way to get there. There's tons of complicated factors, but that's the end state that the global community should be looking to come together, and it's very achievable. It's very, very achievable.
There's as we stand here today, there's a lot of different ways that this war can evolve. If a ground invasion happens by Israeli forces of Gaza, and if the number is correct of 100,000 Israeli soldiers, do you worry about various trajectories that can take of the consequences that might have of an unprecedented ground troop attack?
Yeah, so I think as a leader, you can't change yesterday, but you have the ability to change tomorrow. And that's a very important fundamental. I mean, that's true for all of us, not just leaders. But, we saw with 9/11 how America was caught off guard by a terrorist attack. We acted, somewhat rationally, somewhat emotionally, which led to a 20-year war with trillions of dollars lost. I think almost 1 million lives lost, not just American, but all lives. And it was a total tragedy what occurred. I think right now the temptation is to be strong. I think that's a necessity. I do think eliminating risk is the right objective. I think the goal should be to stay very clear about what the objective is, but also this attack was very well planned, not to walk into another trap. I think you have to be very smart, very cautious. I've been happy to see that what they've been doing in retaliation so far has been somewhat measured, and they've taken their time to try to assess what's achievable. Again, I don't have access to the intelligence, and we're talking at a very early stage in this conflict, so a lot could happen even by the time this is published. But my hope is that they'll just stay very focused on what the objective is and try to make sure that they're acting appropriately in order to do that. And I will say this too, that this has been different than what I've seen in the past, in that the attacks were so heinous and so disgusting that I've seen the international community rally around Israel more so than I ever have. And I hope that Israel continues to keep the moral high ground and continue to communicate what they're fighting for, why they're fighting. And I do hope that the international community supports the objective and they can work together to achieve it.
Benjamin Netanyahu, Bibi, somebody you've gotten to know well in negotiation, in conversation. He has made statements, he has declared war. He has spoken about this potentially being a long and difficult war. What have you learned about the mind of Benjamin Netanyahu that might be important to understand here in this current war?
Bibi is definitely a historic figure. You know, I'd meet with a lot of different world leaders, and some of them I would say they're very, very special, transformational figures, and some I would say, how the hell is this person running a country? And Bibi's somebody who has done a lot for the state of Israel. He has a tremendous understanding of the security apparatus. He has tremendous global relations. So for a crisis like this, I think Bibi's the leader you want if you're Israel to be in that seat. I think he's ambitious in what he's going to look to achieve. He understands his role in history as somebody who's helped strengthen Israel economically, militarily, and I don't think he wants to see his legacy be somebody who left Israel more vulnerable than it had to be. So I think in that regard, he'll be incredibly strong, but I also think that he'll hopefully be calculating in the risks that he takes, and not create more risk than's needed. And that's easy to say, you know, the two of us sitting here having a conversation when you're sitting in that chair as a leader in the fog of war. It's a very, very hard decision to make. He's been here before. He knows the weight of the situation. I'm sure he knows the moment, and I pray that he'll do what's right here to bring the best outcome possible.
I wonder if you can comment on the internal political turmoil that Bibi has been operating in, and how that relates to the tragedy that we saw.
On the one hand, the political turmoil is it's a sign of a vibrant democracy. I think it's been actually nice to see how people have fought for their country and their beliefs in a democratic way. You compare that to the Palestinians, where there's no democracy, there's no free speech, there's no free press. You can't disagree with the leadership. In Israel, if you want to, be homosexual, you can have a go to a parade and live your life. In Gaza, they'll throw you off a building and kill you. It's so in Israel, you have the freedoms, which I think make it a special place, and you have a very vibrant democracy. With that being said, the times in Jewish history where the Jewish people have been most vulnerable have been when there's been division, and that's when the temple was destroyed. But that's not just with the Jewish people and with Israel, that's in all societies. So I definitely believe that this division has left them less prepared for the situation than it would. I do think there's real lessons we should be taking from this here in America, where we're in a time where we're very divided, but I do think that it'd be very wise for our leaders to find the areas where we do agree and find ways to, secure our southern border, to make sure that we know who's in our country, what risks we all face. And I do think that that division definitely creates risk for countries.
Let me switch gears here and just zoom out and look at our society and our public discourse at the moment. What do you make of the scale and nature of the Palestinian support online in response to this situation?
This is something I've observed over the years since I got involved with the Israeli-Palestinian issue with a lot of interest. I think a lot of the people who are pledging support for the Palestinian people, I think that they want to see the Palestinian people live a better life. And I actually agree with them in that regard. Unfortunately, I think many of them are incredibly ill-informed as to the facts on the ground. I think all of the people who are advocating online for the Palestinian people, who are going to these marches in support of them, I think they'd be best served if they really care about effectuating the outcome of joining with Israel right now and directing their anger towards the Hamas leadership. I think that it's very clear that the group that's responsible for the Palestinian people living the lives that all of these people are angry about is Hamas. And if they direct their anger towards Hamas and put the attention on the failings of Hamas and put forth a vision for what they'd like to see leadership in Gaza do, and they respect that there's a real fear that Israel has and any country would have of having a group of terrorists next to them that's calling for their destruction, I think that that recognition of finding a way for Israel to be secure and then having an opportunity for the Palestinian people to live a better life is the right pathway to try and pursue.
So to you, there's a clear distinction between Hamas and the Palestinian people in that Hamas is the enemy of progress and the flourishing of the Palestinian people.
100%. It's very, very clear. And I think that if people were honest about the situation, if they spent the time to really understand it, again, if you follow the conference I did in Bahrain, we had all of the leading businessmen there, and they said, we can rebuild Gaza very easily. We all want to. The leading Arab businessmen, the leading American businessmen, everyone wants to. They're just held back by Hamas. And so I do think having an honest conversation about this at this point in time has really only one logical conclusion. And my hope is that maybe this conflict leads to that conversation being had. And if it is, then maybe that brings more unity and understanding, and we kind of get to a conclusion better that could improve the lives of the Palestinian people.
Pragmatic question about the future. Do you hope Donald Trump wins in 2024, and how can his administration help bring peace to the Middle East?
I think when Donald Trump was president, we had a peaceful world. Everyone said if he was elected, we would have World War III. Meanwhile, he gets elected, and he not only is the first president in decades to not start any wars, he's making peace deals, he's making trade deals, he's working with our allies, getting them to pay their fair share in NATO. He's, having a dialogue with China, with Russia. He's weakening Iran. And so I do think that the job he did as a foreign policy president was tremendous. I think, now more and more people are starting to recognize that. Again, under President Biden, this is the second war that's broken out in the world. And when you have a weak American leadership, the world becomes a less safe place. And so my hope and prayers are that President Trump is reelected and that he's able to then restore order and calm and peace and prosperity to the world.
From a place of strength.
That's the only way he knows how to do it.
What gives you hope about the future of this region, of Israel and of the Middle East?
The Middle East for 20 years was an area of conflict. They spent all their money on bullets and bombs. You have young leadership now in Saudi Arabia and UAE and Qatar, and there's a much more ambitious agenda now for the region to make it an economic superpower and hub of the world. Israel is one of the most burgeoning and exciting tech economies in the world. And if you think about it, it's almost like having Silicon Valley not connected to California. The thing that's held the region back for all these years has just been the conflict and the division and the lack of connectivity. But if you have that region, and if it can all come together, if you can create a security architecture, you have an incredibly young population, you have a lot of wealth and resources, and a lot of capabilities and know-how. And so I think that if it's managed correctly, and if Iran is able to be restrained and suppressed with their ambitions to cause destabilization, I don't mean Iran the country, I mean the Iranian regime, because actually once you have this economic sphere, if you could bring Iraq into it, if you could bring Iran into it, that makes it even bigger and stronger. And the Persian people are incredibly entrepreneurial and incredibly industrious. So I do think that the region has tremendous potential. It's just been held back by bad policy, bad leadership, bad objectives. And again, when President Trump left office in 2021, the Middle East was really on a very, very positive trajectory. And if the right things happen, it can continue to be so. So, I'm praying at this moment in time that we navigate the current crisis, that the important objectives are achieved of eliminating the terrorists and their threats, and then allowing the leaders who are focused on giving their citizens and their neighbors the opportunity to live a better life are able to work together and really dream and be ambitious and find ways to create a paradigm where humans can flourish.
What is the best way to defeat hate in the world?
Hate is a very powerful force, and it's much easier to hate people you don't know. It's funny, when I was working on prison reform, one of the most interesting people I met was a reverend, actually down in Texas, who negotiated the first truce between the Bloods and the Crips, two of the notorious gangs in America in prison. And I was very excited to meet him. And when I met him, I said, well, how'd you do it? And he said, it was very simple. He says, I got all the guys together and I had a tremendous amount of barbecue brought in. He says, and I got them eating. He says, no drinking. He says, drinking sometimes gets people a little bit more against each other. He says, but I got them eating, and they started sitting down together and they started saying, you know what, you're just like me. And all of a sudden they started finding areas where they were more together.
Yeah.
Look, I've traveled all over the world now. I've been very fortunate to meet people from different states in America. I've different political persuasions, different ages, different classes. And what I found is that there's a fundamental driving amongst all of us where we all want to live a better life. And, you know, people don't want to fight naturally, but it's easy to fight when you feel wronged or you feel like somebody disrespected you or somebody did something from hatred. And hatred leads to more hatred, which sometimes just pushes that cycle further and further. So I believe that each and every one of us has the power to stop that cycle. And we don't do it by, you know, being on Twitter and yelling at people. We don't do it by just being critical. We do it by finding the people we disagree with, by listening to them, by asking questions, by sitting with them. And then if we each take responsibility to try to make the world better, then I think that there's no limits to the incredible place that this world can be.
So as you've said, you've traveled all across the world. Do you think most people are good? Most people have love in their heart?
I do believe that. Yeah, and you have some bad people. I mean, you have some real evil people. I mean, a big part of the work I did was on prison reform. And, you know, previously the mentality is that the prison should basically be a warehouse for human trash. And if you've made a mistake in this world, then, you know, we're going to throw you out and we're going to make the rest of your life incredibly difficult because you're going to have a criminal record. You're not going to have access to jobs. But what I found is when I would sit with people in prison, the people I met through my father's experience and who I met along the way, is that, you know, people make mistakes. We're all human. I think it's the right thing from a religious perspective to give people second chances. I always believe you shouldn't judge people by the worst mistake they make in their life. Unfortunately, now in the era of social media, people will say one wrong thing. It sticks with them forever. They get canceled or they get put out. We're all humans. We grow from our mistakes. We learn from our mistakes. And I think that some people are just evil. There are some evil people, but I do think the vast majority of people are good. And I do think that people sometimes also can be in a bad place and then society can push them to a worse and worse place, but we all have the power to make them feel loved, make them feel heard. And I think there's also tremendous power that we have as people to help people get to a better place. And so, you know, my wife and I, we've always tried to be a force for good. We've always tried to be, we've always tried to provide a place where people can discuss with each other. When we were in Washington, we would host dinners at our house all the time, or we would have Democrats and Republicans sitting together. We just had, I saw Senator Feinstein just passed away. We had a great dinner at her house when she was a senator with her and her husband, and Mark Meadows when he was on the Freedom Caucus. And we had actually a fascinating discussion about Iran. Mark was much more hardline than me. I had to actually bite my tongue. I was impressed at how much he did, whereas, Feinstein and her husband were like super into, they knew the Iranians well. They thought they were peace-loving. And it was an incredibly robust and respectful debate. And so I don't think we maybe concluded anything that night, but it was interesting for people to get together, having a dinner at my house where I had Dick Durbin, the number 2 ranking Democrat in the Senate, Lindsey Graham, and Stephen Miller, who's known to be a very hardline on immigration, discussing what an immigration reform could look like. I mean, they left that dinner saying, wow, we hadn't spoken to people on the other side, and we actually agree on like 85% of things, like maybe something is possible. And so I believe that we should always be trying to push to make the world a better place. And you only do that by listening to people and connecting with people and by respecting people. And finally, I'll just say on this is that, you know, I meet people all the time who have so much confidence in their perspectives. And I'm very jealous that these people are able to be so confident about every single thing, because for me, I have, you know, some degree of confidence in the things that I've studied and what I've learned, but I'm always trying to find, you know, people who disagree to kind of sharpen my perspectives and to help me grow and to help me learn further. And so I think that's kind of the beauty of the world, is that, you know, the knowledge base continues to grow, the facts continue to change, and what's possible tomorrow continues to become different. And so as humans, we have to continue to thrive, to learn and to grow and to connect. And if we do that, everything's possible.
Well, Jared, thank you for your compassion, first of all, but also your wisdom today on this very difficult, this tragic set of events, these difficult days for the world. It's a big honor to speak with you again. Every time I speak to you, I learn a lot about the world, and I deeply appreciate, like I said, like your humility and your understanding of the details of all the complex power dynamics and human dynamics that are going on in the world. Once again, thank you for talking today.
Thank you. And Lex, if I could say just one final thing, which is that my thoughts and prayers are really with all of the people in Israel and the innocent civilians as well on the Palestinian side. And my prayers are with the IDF soldiers, that they should be safe and they should be really watched by God to accomplish whatever mission will enable to make the world a safer place.
Thank you for listening to this newly recorded segment of the conversation that addresses the current situation in Israel and Gaza. And now we go on to the second part of the conversation, recorded on Thursday, October 5th. Given your experience in negotiating with some of the most powerful and influential leaders in the world, what's the key to negotiating difficult agreements in geopolitics? Let's start with the big question.
If I look back on the different negotiations I had when I was in government, either with leaders of countries, with representatives of leaders, or even with members of Congress to pass legislation, the most important thing I would draw back to would be trust. I think getting to know each other, understanding what was motivating the other party to get to the outcome, and making them feel like you weren't going to use whatever information they gave you to benefit yourself at the expense of them, is probably what I would call table stakes to have a shot at accomplishing anything that was hard in a negotiation. After that, I would say taking maybe a first principles approach to what the outcome of whatever problem you're looking to solve should be. Now, you have different kinds of negotiations. I always tried to create a framework in the negotiation where it wasn't me against you. It was always, let's agree on what the outcome is that we're trying to accomplish. Let's all sit on the same side of the table and say, we want to get to this outcome. How do we get there? Really trying to create a roadmap. And so once you understand the destination you want to get to, the end point, then you'd have to work backwards and really try to put yourself in their shoes and try to understand what were their motivations macro. Most of the time, you have to assume that a leader's primary objective was to stay in power. And so all decisions made would be made through the framework of what it would take to do that and how it would impact their ability to do that. And then finally, I would just say that in any negotiation, you have to understand the power dynamics as well. And you have to then weight your approach in order to maneuver pieces to accomplish the objective. And so in areas where we had stronger power dynamics, I'd always look at it and say, what are the potential escape routes where a politician would say, this is just the reason why we can't get there? And I'd always think, how can you try to eliminate those escape routes or make them much harder to accomplish? And then ultimately think about what's the golden bridge that you want to create for them in order to get to the other side where they were motivated to get there because it was in their self-interest to get there, but also because it helped accomplish the different objective. And I have many examples that I lived through with that. Obviously, negotiating in Congress for prison reform, I had to form a lot of trust with Democrats, whether it was Hakeem Jeffries or Dick Durbin, and then also on the Republican side with I had Mike Lee, I had Lindsey Graham, I had Tim Scott, Senator Grassley, and then also Doug Collins in the House was tremendous. And, every time we maneuvered something, we would get attacked either from the left. There was a time we were being attacked by, Nancy Pelosi, John Lewis, for not being, inclusive enough. And then there were times that we maneuvered it, we'd be attacked from the right for maybe going too far. And ultimately, we had to find just the right place where we can get it done. And the same thing happened with USMCA, where we were negotiating the biggest trade deal in the history of the world, which was $1.3 trillion in annual trade between Mexico, Canada, the United States of America. And we were able to form good trust with the other side and try to say, how do we create win-win outcomes? And ultimately, we were able to do something in a record time that people thought was very hard to do. And both of them, in a divided time of the Trump administration, were bipartisan wins with big votes in the Senate and the House.
You have a lot of stories of this kind. Sometimes a soft approach, sometimes a hard approach. Like there's, I think, a story where with Bibi, there was a potential, like a dramatic election coming up, and you had to say no excuses, no delaying. We have to make this agreement. I know Bibi cares about Israel more than the particular dynamics of the election. Like you have to draw a hard line there.
But in fairness too, for him, during the time that we were dealing with him, he was always in election versus election and then election. And, what he was saying wasn't wrong. And I think he was more expressing his concerns given the dynamics. And, we never held those concerns against him. We just said those are real concerns he had. We respected those concerns, but then we helped him prioritize to help accomplish the right things. And that's ultimately what the partnership is, right? My job was to represent America. His job was to represent Israel. And you had other parties representing their own interests. And as long as you assumed that, people were acting mostly in good faith, you were able to navigate areas where you didn't have, complete overlap of priorities and objectives.
Just to go back to the trust thing, you sometimes see that with leaders where they're it looks like they're trying to screw over the other person when they're talking. And so not having that, I think, is a really powerful thing for earning trust. Like that people actually can believe that they're results driven and are working towards a certain end. Is there like a skill to that? Like what is that, genetics? You're born with that, or is that something like you develop? So basically it requires you to look at the game of politics and not have a kind of cynicism about it to where everybody's trying to manipulate you, and actually just go in with a kind of open mind and open heart and actually speak truthfully to people, the kind of basic human level.
I would say that I always would think about how can I be a partner to others like I would want somebody to be a partner to me. And a lot of it comes from just my different experiences. In business, I've had great partners. I've had terrible partners. My father, again, a lot of my childhood was I was exposed to business. My father, on Sundays, he would take us to job sites and to the office with him instead of to football games like my friends, fathers would do. And so we were exposed to business. And what he would say about his father, who was an immigrant to America, came over with nothing and no formal education. But he would always say, a good deal with a bad partner will always be a bad deal. And a bad deal with a good partner, you'll figure it out. And so going through some of the challenges that I had in my life early on, whether it was the issue with my father that I'm sure we'll talk about, or even going through some tougher financial times during the great financial crisis, I really learned a lot about partnership. And I always thought, how can I act in a way where I could be the type of partner or friend to others that I wish others would be to me?
So when you look for a good partner, don't you think there's the capacity for both good and bad in every person? So when you negotiate with all of these leaders, aren't there like multiple people you're speaking to inside one person that you're trying to encourage, catalyze like the goodness in the human?
Yeah, so leaders are generally chosen by their country. And so my view was if I had an objective, I didn't get to choose who was the leader of other countries. My job was to deal with that leader, understand their strengths, understand their weaknesses, understand their power dynamics as well. One of my greatest takeaways when I grew up, I'd read the newspapers about all these powerful, famous people. And then as I got older and had the chance to meet them and do business with them, and then ultimately, interact with them in government, is I realized that they're just like you and me. They wake up every morning, their kids are pissed at them, their wife doesn't want to talk with them, and they've got, a set of advisors around them. One saying, let's go to war, one saying, let's make peace, one saying, do the deal, one saying, don't do the deal. And they're all thinking, where do I get advice? How do I make decisions? And so understanding the true human nature of them and then the different power dynamics around them, I thought was very key. And so I didn't have a choice, do I deal with them or not? It was a function of how do you deal with them effectively in order to find areas where you have common interests and then work well together to pursue those common interests in order to achieve a certain goal.
You, first of all, you're incredibly well read. I've gotten to know you and I've gotten to know Ivanka, and the book recommendation list is just incredible. So first of all, thank you for that. You told me about The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman. It's a book on World War I, and I went down a whole rabbit hole there. She's like an incredible historian. But anyway, there's a bunch of stuff you learn from that, but one of the things you told me is it influenced your general approach to diplomacy of just picking up the phone and giving it a try. So as opposed to planning and strategizing, just pick up the phone.
So this was a book I read way before the notion of serving in government was ever even on my mind or a reality. And I remember thinking about it, reading it and thinking how World War I started, where you had somebody was assassinated, and then you had all these different alliances that were created, and then in order to accomplish objectives, it triggered all of these people getting in bed with everyone else because of documents that were created without the intent of going to a massive war. And I think in the course of World War I, it was one of the greatest atrocities that we've seen as humanity. We've had 16 million people killed in that war. And as I was reading the book, I remember thinking to myself, even though, things are set in a certain way, go sit with somebody, go talk to them and say, this doesn't make sense, this is wrong, how do we create a better pathway? And as a civilian, all my life, I would read the newspapers, I would observe how different leaders would act. But when we had the opportunity to serve in government and have the position, you realize you're not a civilian. You don't have the luxury of sitting back and letting the world happen the way it's happening. You have agency and you have the potential to influence the outcome of things. And one thing I've seen is, most political prognosticators are wrong. Anyone who tells you what's going to happen really has no clue. And it's not because they're bad or they're not intelligent. It's because nobody knows. And at the end of the day, the outcomes in the world are usually driven by the decisions of humans. And if you're able to come together, form relationships, listen to each other, you can do that. And one of the great examples that I speak about in the book is with North Korea. Whereas if you remember in 2017, it was very intense. When President Obama was leaving office, he told President Trump that the single biggest fear that he had, and this is a time when the world was a mess. You had the Middle East was on fire. ISIS was beheading journalists and killing Christians. They had a caliphate the size of Ohio. Libya was destabilized. Yemen was destabilized. Syria was in a civil war where 500,000 people were killed. Iran was on a glide path to a nuclear weapon. Yet the single biggest fear he had was North Korea. Then it got compounded by the fact that we get into office and President Trump brings his generals around and he's learning how to interact with all the generals and says, okay, what are my options? And they said, calm down. We've been using all of our ammunition in the Middle East. We don't have enough ammunition to go to war over there. And he says, let's not let that be too public. Let's try to restock and come up with a plan.
Yeah.
And at the time, there was a lot of banter back and forth. And I was able to. I got a call from a friend who was an old business contact who actually had done business in North Korea. And he said, I'd love to find a way to solve this. And I was getting calls from friends at the time saying, I'm trying to go to Hawaii for vacation. Should I not be going? Is it not safe? I mean, we forget the psychology of how intense that was at the time. And then through that interaction, he called some of his contacts in North Korea. And then we were able with the CIA to open up a back channel that ultimately led to the de-escalation, the meeting between Trump and Kim Jong-un, which led to a de-escalation. So that was really the mindset, which was whenever there's a problem, just pick up the phone and try. And I think President Trump had a very similar approach, which was let's give it a shot. And he wasn't afraid to go after the hard ones too. And I'll say one final thing on this, which is that in politics, the incentive structure is just much different than in the real world, right? In the sense that you have a hard problem, then if you try to solve a hard problem, the likelihood of failure is great. Whereas in the business world, if you're going after a hard problem, we celebrate those people, right? We want our entrepreneurs and our great people to go after solving the big hard problems. But in politics, if you try to take on a hard problem, you have a high likelihood of failure. You'll get a lot of criticism on your pathway to trying to accomplish that if you fail. And then if you fail, it has a higher probability of leading to you losing your opportunity to serve. And so it's just one of these things where people want to play it safe, which is not the notion that really was taken during the time that President Trump was in office.
Do you think it has to be that way? I think there's something in the human spirit, like in the public, that desires politicians to take on the big, bold problems, right? Like why is it the politicians need to be so afraid of failure?
I don't think it has to be that way. And that's, I think, one of the great lessons from the time of the Trump administration. He brought a lot of people from the business world into government. The business people have a much different mindset than government people, and there was a lot of resistance. And I think part of why there was so much resistance was because, I think about it from my personal sense, was that if I was successful with no traditional qualifications to do diplomacy, it meant that all the people with traditional qualifications in diplomacy didn't necessarily need those qualifications in order to be successful. And that same sentiment manifested itself in many areas in government. And I think that in the business world, it's outcome oriented, it's results oriented. And what we would see in New York is they would stab you in the eye. In DC, they would stab you in the back. And it just became a whole different dynamic of how you work through these different areas. So the answer is it doesn't have to be that way. You just need the right courageous leader. And that's why I'm so optimistic about what the future of America and the world could be if you have the right people in power who are willing to take on the right challenges and do it in the right way.
So if we just linger on the North Korea and the de-escalation and the meeting, what's the trajectory from this could be the most catastrophic thing that destroys the world to you find back channels, you start talking and start arranging the meeting? Like, is there some insights you can give to how difficult that is to do in the North Korea case, which seems like to be one of the more closed off parts of the world, and in the other cases that you worked on?
Yeah, it's always very challenging, and especially when you're going against the grain of what's established, right? We did something different to think that an old business contact that I had could then do it. I mean, that's the type of thing that, if the press knew what we were doing, they would have, derided it and criticized it in every which way. Mm-hmm. But that was one of the benefits of operating very much below the radar, is that we were able to try all these different things. And not all of them worked, but some of them did. And, but that is what's amazing about the world, right? This could be the biggest story on the front page of every paper, and they're inciting fear in everyone. And it's not illegitimate fear. I mean, there were missile tests, over Japan. I mean, you had a lot of very big challenges with that file. And then all of a sudden we make contact, we go through negotiations to set a meeting. There's a meeting between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. And then all of a sudden there's a framework to try and move things forward. And again, I think that there's a lot of possibility there for what could happen if it's worked in the right way.
I just want to know, like, how you word that first email or text message, like what emojis to use, like the hugging emoji. I mean, it's just personally, I've gotten to know a lot of powerful and rich people, and it's funny that they're all human, just like you're saying. And like a lot of the drama, a lot of the problems can be resolved with just like a little camaraderie, a little kindness, a little just reaching out.
We're all human beings, and people want to be successful, and people want to be good, and you're right too. There's way more emojis involved in diplomacy than I ever would have expected. And
every leader, I'm sure, has their favorite emoji. This is also I learned about people that use, like there's everybody has their go-to emoji. Like I usually go to the heart very quickly emoji. There's some people who go the hugging, whatever that where you're like doing the hugging thing. Anyway. This conversation quickly turned to the ridiculous. But to do another book reference, you mentioned the book 13 Days in September by Lawrence Wright in discussing all the work you've done in Israel and the Middle East. I just want to ask you sort of the interesting aspect of that book, which is the influence of the personalities and personal relationships on these negotiations. You kind of started to allude to that with the trust, but how much do the personalities matter in this? So going from North Korea to the Middle East here to within Congress and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, completely in every way. I mean, that's an incredible book, and it's a very entertaining read. It has obviously a lot of good historical context on some of the key players, whether it was Anwar Sadat or Menachem Begin or Jimmy Carter and Cy Vance and a lot of the others who were involved with those negotiations. And the thing that I kind of took from that experience was just how personal it was. And again, one of my favorite stories from that book was how Anwar Sadat, who was a big leader, he had a mystic who was, according to this book, again, history, I like reading it, but I always, realize that you have to notice that this is just the perspective of a given author that's writing it. But the way that they write this book was that he had an advisor who was a mystic, and the mystic was having a back channel with the Israelis. And the mystic told Sadat, if you go to Israel and you make a speech at the Knesset, Begin is ready to give you the Sinai. And so he goes to Israel. They set this whole thing up. He goes and gives the Knesset. They go for their meeting after. And Sadat says, okay, well, are we going to do this thing? And Begin says, what are you talking about? I'm not giving you an inch of our land. And it was just one of these things where it was a miscommunication that brought about the symbolic visit of Anwar Sadat to Israel. And that was one of these notions that just made everyone think that something was possible that they thought was impossible a moment before. Actually, we had an example like that during our time in government when we did the Abraham Accords. The first step of the Accords was really a phone call between President Trump, Prime Minister Netanyahu, and Mohammed bin Zayed, who at that point was the crown prince and de facto ruler of the UAE. But all we had was a phone call and then a statement that was released. And what was interesting after that is we said, okay, well, how do we integrate countries? Nobody's done this in a long time. And we were trying to figure out all the issues. And there's big miscommunications between Israel and UAE, and we were navigating through all the issues. And so after a couple weeks, I said, I've got to go over there and try to sort through these issues. So we make a plan to go to Israel, then we can go to UAE. And then a young gentleman who worked with me named Avi Berkowitz says, well, if we're flying from Israel to UAE, instead of flying on a government plane, why don't we see if we can get an El Al plane and we'll do the first official commercial flight. And so I said, that's a great idea. Let's call, Ambassador Taiba Youssef, who was a tremendous player in the Abraham Accords, working behind the scenes, day and night, and was really a big catalyst. So he calls Youssef and he said, sure, no problem. Let's give it a shot. So we go and we do it. And he says, if we can work out these issues, we'll do it. So we go to Israel, we do our meetings, we get everything back into a good place. We set up this trip over. We fly in an El Al plane. We fill it up. At the time, it was during COVID with a health delegation. We had the financial ministry because we had to open up banking relationships so they could wire money between countries. We wanted to get health partnerships. Then we just had a lot of legal things and national security things we wanted to start putting together. So we do this flight, and we end up landing in UAE. And the picture of us coming off the plane being greeted by, Emiratis and Tobes with a El Al plane with an Israeli flag on it just captured everyone's imagination. And so it was one of these things where it's like you work so hard on the details and the negotiation. I mean, hundreds of hours to kind of make sure everything's perfect. And the one thing that you do kind of, let's give it a shot. That image ended up capturing everyone's heart. So going back to Sadat, that visit was very critical. And what was interesting is according to this book, it happened because of a miscommunication. That was the first part. The second part of the book, that's just amazing theater. And actually the book was based on a play. It was just going back and forth with all of the different methodologies that they tried that failed, but they kept trying out it. And then ultimately seeing how the personalities were able to find ways to make the compromise that ultimately was a very, very big thing for more stability in the Middle East. And so amazing book. I would highly recommend it. A very entertaining read and something that at least gave me encouragement to keep going when the task I was pursuing seemed so large.
I mean, if we could just linger on the personalities, you write in the book that words matter, or you write in the context of saying in the diplomacy business, words matter, and then you said that we're in the results business. It's a badass line, but if we just stick to the diplomacy business and words mattering, it seems like one of the things you really highlight that individual words can really have, like, you can fight over individual words. So, like, how do you operate in a world where Like, single words matter.
I think you have to be respectful to the craft that you're in, where words matter, but then realize that they don't matter as much. And then also focus on the fact that, the actions are actually what's going to matter more than the words. And so you have a difference between leaders and politicians. Politicians are there to say the right thing and to hold the power. Leaders are people who are willing to do things that will be transformational from my perspective. And so when I would think about diplomacy, words without actions or without the threat of actions, and that was something that President Trump did very well, was that people knew that he was willing to take action. He was very unpredictable in how he would act, and that made our words much more effective in what they did. So it's all a combination, but coming from the private sector, we were all about results, right? If you're in government, you can work on something for 10 years and fail and then retire and they consider you an expert. In the private sector, if you work on something for 10 weeks and you don't have a success, then you're unemployed, So it's a different kind of notion. And it was just understanding the mentality and trying to adjust and bridging the divides between the different trainings.
Is that the biggest thing you took from your business background? Is that just be really results focused?
It was just the only way to be. I mean, if I was giving up a nice life in New York, and if I was giving up, the stuff that I really enjoyed, the company that I'd helped build, and the life that I was enjoying in order to do government, I was going there to make a difference, and we had to focus on it. The other skill set, so there was a couple skill sets that I found were quite deficient in government. First of all, there was a ton of amazing people. I mean, people talk about the bureaucracy. What I found is you had incredibly committed, passionate, intelligent, capable people all throughout the government. And what they were waiting for, though, was direction and then cover in order to get there. And so there were a lot of tasks that I worked on, whether it was, building the wall at the southern border, where I was able to work with, Customs Border Patrol, Army Corps of Engineers, military, DHS professionals, DOD. And we basically all came together. And then once we had a good project management plan, we were able to kind of move very, very quickly. I think we built about 470 miles of border barrier in about 2 years, basically. And that worked very well because we basically brought private sector project management skill sets, which were quite often missing in government. The second one is just, we spoke about negotiation earlier. I would say that most people in government, it's just a different form of negotiation than you see in the private sector, and way less effective in that regard, which is why I think it's good the more we can encourage more people with private sector experience to do a stint in government and to really try to contribute and serve their country. That's how our founders, George Washington and all the founding fathers, they were working on their farms. They left their farms serving government, and they went back to the farm. And that was kind of the design of the representative government. It wasn't a career political class. It was, people coming in to, show gratitude for the freedoms and the liberties that they enjoyed, and then, do their best to kind of, help others have those same opportunities that they had, and then they'd go back and live their lives. And so I think that there's a lot of opportunity with our government of people with more business mindsets who are going to think about things from a solutions perspective, go and serve.
Is that one of the main problems here? So you also mentioned the book, The Great Degeneration by Neil Ferguson, an awesome historian. He's been on this podcast. It helped you understand the inefficiencies of government regulation. I'd love it if you can give an insight into why government is so inefficient at times. Like when it is inefficient, when it doesn't work, why is that the case? The bureaucracy that you spoke to, the negative aspects of the bureaucracy.
So we don't have enough time on this podcast to go into it, but it's look, there's a lot of aspects that work as well, right? But I do think we've gotten too big. Neil's book that you mentioned, one of the things that I took from that, I read it, I think in 2012, right, kind of in the middle of the great financial crisis, was he was talking about how government regulation often was put in place to deal with old crises, right? So it was never going to solve future problems. It was more to kind of to solve for problems that had happened in the past. And I remember thinking about that. One thing I was very proud of the work of the Trump administration was that you had 4 years consecutively where there was a net decrease in the cost of regulations. So to give you a context, in the last year of Obama in 2016, there were 6 million man hours spent by the private sector complying with new federal regulations. And that's not really what the intent of our government was, right? If we have rules or regulations, those should be legislated by Congress. They shouldn't be put in by, by bureaucrats who are basically saying, I want to follow this objective. So using kind of the power of the pen in order to do that. So the deregulatory effort was actually very critical to Trump's economic success that happened at the beginning of the administration. And then what I saw with regulation was anytime either there was legislation or regulation coming, the people pushing for it were usually the people who would benefit from the regulatory capture. So you had these, you look at, the great financial crisis where you had these big banking reforms. But what happened during the big banking reforms? Then you had a big reduction in the amount of banks that occurred, and the big banks became even bigger. Whereas I don't think that was the intention of the legislation, but the people who were writing the legislation and influencing it had a lot of the constituencies from those larger institutions. And then what happened as a result of that? A lot of these smaller institutions didn't have the ability to be as competitive. They had more restrictions, more costs. They became less profitable. But these were the banks that were serving small business, which is the biggest creator of jobs in our country. And then as a result, the bigger banks got more powerful. And what happened in the country as a result of the regulations that they put in place, the wealth gap in the country grew. It didn't shrink. And so I think oftentimes what they say these regulations are intended to be, the result often becomes the opposite. And so, what President Trump did